One of the most difficult or thorny, wicked problems that can hit a business are those so-called black swans, events that happen sometimes seemingly out of the blue, sometimes with a bit of warning, but things that we weren't expecting. And one of the most pressing of these, or one of the most difficult of these that's happened over recent years, was the announcement on the 26th of March 2020 that businesses had to, and people had to stay in their homes and businesses were locked down. My next guest is Sean Jacob. He ran FTA Global, a flight school that trained pilots from no flying experience at all the way up to being fit for flying commercial airliners. Sean's business was badly affected by COVID because, of course, everything was grounded. And so how do you teach students to fly if you can't even get them to the school, if you can't get the flights up? We're going to talk about that. Sean's going to talk to us about the lessons he's learnt, having been in really what was a very difficult position, and one ultimately that wasn't recoverable from. We talk a lot in business, and particularly with things like Agile, about learning from failures, how failing is a learning opportunity, fail fast, which really means identify when something might fail and pivot away from that failure to something successful. But what rarely happens is that people spend enough time actually learning from other people's failures. Everyone wants to learn from success, and why not? It's great if people have been successful, but we also ought to pay attention to where failures happen so that we can learn from those. So without further ado, I give you Sean Jacob. Enjoy. Sean, welcome to Wicked Problems. It's really great to have you on. I think your story is a very interesting one, but also really important one that we get out there. And I really think it's going to be something that's going to be of great interest. We hear a lot about how failure is something we can learn from. And very often I think we don't bother to learn from it. Now, before we go into that, I also think we should just acknowledge there's been a lot of success in your career. I want to get that on the table, but I think it's really good that there's been this event that happened, and what you're really doing is learning from that, but also helping other people to learn from that. But over to you, Sean. We think it'd be great if you could tell us your story.
Thanks, Toby, and I appreciate you highlighting the positives as well as the negatives. But today, I just wanted to talk about the journey I went through with FTA, a commercial flying school. I'm going to start at the end because on Tuesday, the 23rd of May, at about 9:30 in the morning, I was looking out of the meeting room window, having just told all of the staff that the company was closing and that they all lost their positions. It wasn't a great surprise to them because I'd been as transparent as possible over the previous 18 months in terms of our search for funding and search for additional investment. But the night before, Monday the 22nd, I'd written to the staff and I'd also written to all of the students. And even as I was talking to the staff and explaining what the next steps were going to be and what was happening, out of the corner of my eye, I could see hundreds of students, their parents, the BBC, ITV, newspapers, all mulling around outside of our office wanting to talk to me. And I'd already set a meeting in place to go through with the students at 10 o'clock. But it really brought it home to me what an impact closing this business was going to have on literally hundreds of people, not just the staff, not just the students, but those other businesses that we've been working with over the previous few years. And that in itself is a position I wouldn't want any senior executive to have to be in. It's a really horrible feeling in the pit of your stomach when you know that you've got to the point where you can't take a business forward any further and that all of the options are being closed to you and the only one that you can think about is shutting the business down. So that was an absolute low point. And I want to talk about how I got to that point, some of the events that have happened on the journey there, and some of the learnings that I hope we can take away from that.
Fantastic. So, just before we do get into that, I wonder if you could just explain the nature of the business to anyone who's watching or listening, just so that they understand what kind of business this was.
Absolutely. So FTA was a commercial flight school set up to train generally students who'd come straight out of sixth form or out of university with little or no flying experience, taking them all the way through to what's called an ATPL, an air transport pilot's license, which is the piece of paper you need to go and fly an Airbus A320 or a Boeing 737. And the majority of our graduates were working for people like Ryanair, EasyJet, Wizz, so going on to become commercial pilots. And the company had been going for circa 15 years when I took it over in March 2020.
Wow.
March 2020 is probably a good point to roll back to, because I'd been talking to the company for 4 or 5 months before I took over, both as a shareholder and as a managing director on March the 2nd, 2020. And I know you'll appreciate, Toby, that at that time, COVID was in its very early stages. Everybody was talking about it. Nobody was quite sure on what the impact was going to be. Over the preceding few weeks through February, I think the first few deaths had been announced. Numbers were in the teens. I mean, it was ridiculously low, but obviously things were starting to pick up, and it was starting to become exponential in terms of its effect. And that first couple of weeks that I was there in March, we had welcomed a new cohort of students. So 12 students had started with us at the beginning of March, but I'd been working with the staff on possible mitigations if we weren't able to come into the airfield anymore. And sure enough, just 3 weeks later, on the 23rd of March, we had that announcement from Boris Johnson, first lockdown, and everybody was to stay at home. So a few frantic phone calls on that evening, and we made sure that nobody came to the airfield. But within 24 hours, we had a distance learning option set up. So our instructors were coming in and were talking to an empty classroom, talking to a camera, and all of the students who were on ground school or involved in the ground school stages were logging on to their laptops at home. And in fact, we continued to deliver ground school like that for the next 15 months, although it wasn't a brilliant experience for the students because they were at home and weren't able to go anywhere. And they were fully focused on their learning. In fact, our exam results, average pass rates, and the number of students passing actually went up quite dramatically over that 15-month period with a captive audience that we had there.
That's quite impressive in itself, because that's a time where we're all stuck at home. So, your flights are grounded, everyone's at home, and yet you're still, you're a fly school, but still you're managing to get your success rates up in terms
That's
of
exactly
exams.
right. And on the flight side, for about 3 months, we were on the ground. I think everybody appreciated that airlines stopped flying, we stopped flying. But almost from the first day, we'd started putting in place processes and procedures that we'd be able to use to mitigate against the effects of the coronavirus. We had to document all of that, and we sent it off to the CAA and to the Department for Transport. And after repeated calls and repeated iterations with both the Department for Transport and the CAA, we finally got permission to start our flying training again. And that was very different for both the staff and for the students. Seeing an instructor and a student going out to an aircraft with a mask and visor and rubber gloves and having to effectively decontaminate the aircraft after each flight, wiping round with sterile wipes. So again, big changes to the way that we were operating, and it wasn't ideal. A lot of flight training is all about communications, and students were having to talk to air traffic control through a mask, and we quickly learnt that there were issues caused by trying to fly with gloves on, trying to fly with a mask on. Students who wore glasses were finding that their glasses were steaming up from wearing a mask. So we went through a number of iterations, but we managed to get flying again circa 3 months after that initial lockdown, and back up to full strength flying by the end of 2020. The commercial flight training is a massive investment, and really, once you take into account accommodation and students having to move to the school from different parts of the country, generally they're looking at a budget of about £100,000 to go from zero experience to an ATPL. And FTA, like a lot of the commercial schools, all of the commercial schools in the UK at the time, were working on a deferred income model. So students would pay a fairly chunky deposit. When I took over, they were paying a £14,000 deposit, and then were paying the balance of those fees over a 12-month period. And one of my initial learnings over that first few months is that the school had been operating on effectively on a Peter pays Paul model. So rather than accruing funds from each of the students, as cash came into the company, that cash was being used. A model which works perfectly if you're in a growth situation where each course has got more students than the last and you've got a continual throughput of students coming into the school. But as you can imagine, as we went further and further into 2020, the pipeline started to drop off. There was an announcement from BALPA, which is the British Airline Pilots Association, strongly recommending that people didn't come into the airline industry, that they couldn't see a future. They knew that they had thousands of pilots who were sat on furlough, sat at home waiting to start flying again. A number of airlines actually shut down through that period and went themselves into liquidation and administration. So BALPA were thinking, we're going to have a lot of experienced and qualified pilots here. So the idea that more people should be training and coming into this industry was crazy. So on all sides, we were being presented with a very, very difficult landscape to continue to recruit new students and train new students.
I was going to say, probably worth just acknowledging here that at that time, nobody knew the outcome of the pandemic, right? We didn't have, it wasn't until sometime later that we actually had vaccination and ways out of the pandemic. So at that time, this could have gone on for years and years and years in the eyes of governments and businesses and so on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and it wasn't until early 21, as you say, that the vaccines came in and some sort of ending came in. But even through 2021, we still had the second and third lockdown, so it didn't stop. And our pipeline had dribbled down. And at the time, I had a couple of key drivers. I wanted to ensure that all of the students who are currently enrolled at the school were able to continue their training. And I wanted to keep jobs for all of the staff that were employed by the school. And the school employed about 35 people. And those became my drivers. I looked at our financial plan. I saw that we were going to be running out of money probably towards the end of 2021. So midway through 2021, I started seeking external investment. I knew that we were going to need additional working capital to see us through the pandemic, and all my efforts went into talking to other commercial schools to see if they would be interested in effectively joining up with us, talking to high net worth individuals, talking to private equity companies. And I would say probably 2/3 of my time was spent just looking for external investment, looking for that additional working capital that we were going to need to keep going. By the beginning of 2022, our financial runway had diminished to the fact that I could only see a few weeks ahead, and we hadn't secured any additional funding. And I knew that to continue, we were going to have to start borrowing money. At the beginning of 2022, I took a loan from Funding Circle. We'd also taken some additional lending from the company that were financing the aircraft in the form of civil loans. So we had increased the debt on the company, but we had some money in the bank to work with, and that allowed us to continue forward. And throughout 2022, I continued this search for external investment. And I guess, one of my lessons late 21, early 22 was make sure that you've got the right financial support for your company. I realise now, and hindsight is a wonderful thing, and a lot of this, Toby, is a hindsight view, looking in the rearview mirror. What could I have done better? And one of the things that I should have done better is get much better financial advice and get much stronger financial people involved in the company. So, this was a circa 5 million turnover organisation, and we didn't have a CFO. I didn't even have a finance manager, so all of the financing was being done by a financial controller who frankly was probably out of his depth and wasn't able to come up with the sort of forecasts and projections that we really needed to make some informed decisions with. So a lot of that financial information was lacking. And I would also say, because we ended up changing our accountants, that the accountancy firm that was doing our statutory accounts and doing our returns, again, probably wasn't able to deal with a company of the complexity of FDA. So those were two key learnings, and something that I should have picked up on much earlier, I think, in terms of that financial information.
It's good that you bring out these key learnings, because I think, you say hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, but the power of hindsight, I think, is often when we as leaders in our own businesses hear these stories, or these, where risk has turned into an issue that's, become a problem that maybe couldn't be solved. But the value of the hindsight then is being able to share that with other leaders, so they don't then fall into the same traps. And I think these are traps, not mistakes, because I use that word intentionally, because it's too easy to say, oh, we made a mistake here. Like, sometimes you can't see the trap until you stepped into it. And so being able to point out to other people that there's a trap in front of you, potentially, gives them a way to spot it. So I think that's a really important point that I just wanted to bring out here.
No, that is absolutely key, Tony. And I think another trap that I probably fell into, and another lesson learned, was having somebody else to bounce ideas off and to share the strain. And it really was a pressure that I was under to keep this company moving forward and to be able to continue it. My co-shareholder and fellow director is a gentleman, I won't name him on this channel, but in his late 70s, who'd been looking to retire for the previous 5 years, and certainly wasn't in a position to help with the very dynamic and very difficult circumstances that we found ourselves in. So a lot of the time, I found myself sat at a desk on my own with nobody to share ideas with, nobody to share thoughts with. And again, a key learning, a lot of this stuff you just can't do on your own. And however brilliant you may think of yourself as a leader, as an executive, as a manager, sometimes you just need somebody else sharing those thoughts, sharing those ideas, and coming up with a way forward. And again, throughout the most of 2022, I didn't have that. I was fortunate because towards the end of 2022, a key figure in the aviation training industry, who I've been speaking to over the last few months, said that he would come on board as a strategic advisor. And then I started working very closely with him over the last 9 months. And that made a tremendous difference. He was able to do some of the heavy lifting on the financial side. He helped recruit a new financial manager. So we started to strengthen that side of the business. And with his experience of the industry, we started to be able to reach out even further within a network in terms of other people who may have been interested. So it just gave me another set of legs. It was a bit like a tag team, having somebody else there to allow you to take a step back, take a breath, and just gather your thoughts before moving forward again was really, really important.
I hear that said a lot about leadership in general, right? So in the good times, that people, it's lonely at the top. People really value having a soundboard or being able to get thought leadership, or to help them, just to help frame the thinking that they're going through. During a pandemic, when the business model looks like it's falling apart, it must be even more useful, even more important. What's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And as you say, we'd almost got used to not having that social contact, not having those face-to-face meetings, do everything as we are now online. That became the norm, but it also made some of those interactions incredibly difficult. And it was just one other barrier. Again, taking those lessons, that the hindsight that we've picked up from this. I was trying to drive a business forward in the worst possible landscape. Everybody was saying, don't come into this industry, don't start training. So our pipeline was completely shattered. And we had very little juice in the tank in order to keep us going with the existing staff and the existing students. So the other lessons that I started to learn through the second half of 2022 was the ability to work very, very closely with suppliers. Openness was the only route forward, openness and honesty. And I had countless conversations with the partners and suppliers that we were working with, explaining on a regular basis the position we were in, what our finance looked like this week, what our finances were going to look like next month, what I needed from them, what I was able to do from my side. And it was those conversations that enabled us to keep going, probably, I think, for a year longer than we would have been able to otherwise. Because the aviation industry is so interdependent on partners. Effectively a small community grows up around an airfield. You've got the people operating the airfield itself. You've got everything from air traffic control and fuel and fire services to the people servicing the aircraft. And it was crucial that all of those people understood the position that we were in, and I was as open as possible with them. And that openness, as I said, I think allowed us to continue probably far longer than we should have done. And again, one of those lessons that we should probably talk about is making that very difficult decision as when to stop. Probably in the whole 2-year period, that the worst decision that I made was that I was going to dig into my own pocket and put my own money to support the business, to create that additional working capital that we needed going forward, without any clear commitment from an external, from a third party, that they were going to be able to come in and provide that additional working capital. So I ended up providing it myself. And that was very hard. It required conversations with my family, with my wife, to say that this is what we were going to do. And as a result of that, I actually put our family house on the line to enable us to continue.
That must be hard.
It was incredibly hard. Again, I guess I had the belief that this would take us through, to give us enough runway to get off the ground and for this business to be able to continue forward. As I'm sat here now, I can tell you that didn't happen, and we've had to sell the house, and I'm downsizing now. So one of the outcomes that we weren't looking for, but a really, really, really tough decision. Through all of this, the other people that I needed to think about and keep on side were the staff. And I was having regular monthly meetings with the staff, weekly meetings with the management team. And again, just being as transparent as possible, letting them know who we were talking to, where we were going to for this additional investment, what the situation was with each of those potential partners, and how those discussions were going. And again, in hindsight, I was presenting that as positively as possible when I knew that some of those conversations were unlikely to go as far as I wanted them to. And is it probably one of the options would have been to start downsizing much earlier than we did, to lay staff off, to let staff go. But because of the number of students that we had on board, in order for me to be able to deliver and to keep my commitments going to those students that we had in the school, I needed the number of staff that we had. When you've got students who are there on effectively a 2-year training course, you can't just pull the plug and tell them all to go home, or tell half of them to go home. So these were all decisions that came into the mix, and that I had to decide upon. Something else that I did very early on, and the first meetings were in January 22, and then the next set of meetings were in January 23, was to get an insolvency practitioner involved. And again, the thought of talking to an insolvency practitioner initially had filled me with dread. But insolvency practitioners have got so much knowledge. They have been in this space. An insolvency practitioner isn't just there to close a company down. And again, one of the biggest learnings coming out of this journey has been the support and information and knowledge that you can get from an insolvency practitioner. In January 22, having set out what I was doing, the forecasts, the plans, the conversations I was having, the different companies that I was talking to, the insolvency practitioners were very, very supportive. And they gave me 2 reassurances. One, that I was trading legally, and that everything I was doing was, in the best interests of the company, the best interests of the staff, and the best interests of the students. So that was a reassurance. And secondly, they gave me some thoughts as to what else I might be able to do, other options, other considerations that I might want to put on the table. So that was hugely helpful. And again, I'd say to other people who find themselves or think they're going to find themselves in a similar position, take that advice as early as possible. Generally, those initial meetings with an insolvency practitioner are free. They'll happily come on board and start talking to you and discussing and having a look at your business. And I think that's really important. And it was something I was, really, really glad that I did. So I've got to effectively the end of 2022. I've put my house on the line. I've invested further money into the organisation. I'm continuing to have those conversations with suppliers and with partners. And at the same time, I'm trying to make a difference to the aviation training industry. So we had a big play and made a change to that whole payment process that was causing us so much pain. So dramatically reducing our deposit sizes, extending our payment terms. But although that was for the good of students and for the good of the industry, and lessons that I know that we've introduced have been taken on by other commercial schools now. So I'm delighted that we had a longer term impact there. But it was, again, decimating for our cash flow. I knew that by making those changes, really, we should have been trying to pull as much cash in as early as possible. And we decided that we weren't going to do that. That wasn't to the benefit of any of the students. What I had hoped would happen was by changing those payment terms, we would increase the volume of students coming in. But the landscape was still such that there was still a lot of nervousness out there, and students were still thinking long and hard about whether this was a career that they wanted to take up. So the timing was poor, the timing was bad, and those changes didn't make any difference. So I found myself in spring of this year, spring of 2023, with resources rapidly diminishing and a really, really tough decision to take. By the spring, I was having weekly meetings with the insolvency practitioner, effectively putting every step that I was taking past them to say that, this is what we're looking at doing, this is what we're doing next. But by early May 2023, I was down to just 2 interested parties who thought they might be able to come on board. One of those dropped out the week before we shut the company down. And then almost out of nowhere, the last person effectively who was on the list in my telephone book, came down and spent a day with us looking at the organisation. Somebody who had already bought companies out of administration and so, had a lot of experience in this space. But after a day looking at us, looking at the industry, looking at the landscape, said, "I'm sorry, Sean, we're not going to be able to help." And at that point, there were no further options. There was nobody else that I could turn to. I had no further resources of my own. And that was the point that I decided that the business would have to shut. And probably the toughest decision I've ever had to make.
I can imagine that must have been horrible. And it's not that long ago either. It must be still quite fresh in the mind. What was it like the day that you had to go and tell everyone? How did that play out?
I was very late in the office on that Monday. As I said earlier, I wrote 2 quite detailed emails, one to the staff just explaining what the next steps were, the reason that we were having to shut and why we were moving forward, and then another one to the students. And both students and staff were massively impacted. We closed the business towards the end of the month. There was no money left in the bank account for staff to be paid, so they had to resort to the government insolvency packages that were available, but it's not immediate. There's a few weeks delay before that money comes out. So I knew all of the staff were being inconvenienced. And likewise, students. There was nothing left in the kitty. Students weren't going to be getting a refund, and some of those students will have lost several tens of thousands of pounds. And so writing to them, letting them know that this was the position we were going to be in, was very different to, knowing that money was going to be lost by the bank and that money was going to be lost by some of our partners and our suppliers. But for everybody affected, I took it personally because I knew how much money that we'd lost as well as an individual and as a family. That meeting, and I thought it was very, very important for me to stand up in front of the students, in front of their parents, in front of their grandparents, in front of their sponsors, and explain all of the steps that I've been through and why I was closing the company down. It was a pivotal meeting for me because I could have sat at home. I could have just left it as an email and I could have ignored all of them. I wasn't obliged to stand up there, but it was really, really important for me to go out and face everybody and say, this is what has happened. I guess the impact of that is such that it was on the news, it was on ITV and it was on BBC. So, I appreciate the impact closing the company had down. When you close a business down and it makes the national news, then you realise the impact that it's having across the region. But if it had been 300 or 500 years ago, I think it would have been a proper lynch mob that I would have been talking to, and they would have been there with pitchforks and burning torches. But as it happened, I stood in front of circa 150 people, and instead of being armed with pitchforks and burning torches, they were armed with mobile phones, and a lot of them were recording my announcement and the way that I was answering all of those questions. And again, social media is what we have to face nowadays, rather than being strung up to a tree. But in some ways, facing social media is just as painful, and that was a difficult few days.
I bet it was. I think there's a theme that's coming through on this, and we're just about at time. So, but I just wanted to tease out this theme, which is you worked a lot with your suppliers, with your creditors, with the insolvency practice, with your clients who were, the people who wanted to be trained as pilots, with their stakeholders, my parents, grandparents, whoever, and of course the trainers. And the thing that comes through this for me, which I think is a great aspect of leadership actually, is transparency. And so there's been a lot of transparency from yourself and presumably from other people within the business towards all these people. And I'm guessing that probably made it, easy is maybe the wrong word, but it made it, like if you had gone and hidden behind the sofa and not gone in, I think you would probably have faced more of a social media lynching than perhaps you got, and I'm sure you did get one, but I would assume you would have faced more of one, because actually with leadership, courage and transparency are great qualities to bring forward into a business. So well done for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, there were three key things that sort of come out of that part and that part of the journey. One is accountability, and it was really important to me that I remained and was accountable. It was nobody else's fault. I was the managing director, I was the co-owner, and it was down to me. It was my decision. So with all of the help from everybody else, the buck stopped here, and I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that I was accountable. So that was really important. I think in these situations, you have to face bad days as well as you possibly can. There will always be bad days, whatever organization you're leading, whatever you're doing. I faced some particularly bleak, some particularly bad days, but I think as a leader, you have to face bad days well, and you have to make sure that you're dealing with those as well as you deal with all of the successful and positive days that you have in your life. And the third, and possibly the most important, is to stay positive. And out of all of this, and the reason that I'm doing this session today, a lot of positivity comes out of this. It's about learning, it's about understanding, and it's about being able to take lessons away from an episode like this. And if you go on a journey, like the journey that I've been on over the last 2 years, it's like the most complicated management training exercise ever. But it's real, it's affecting people, it's affecting lives, and it really, really puts you on your toes and lets you know how you're going to react in those circumstances. So I have remained resolutely positive through this whole exercise, and I want to take the lessons away from it. And like on a session today, Toby, I want to share as many of these lessons as possible with other people.
Thank you, Sean. Just before we close off, two final questions. One is, if you had one thing you would like to distill as a piece of advice to anybody out there who's running a business and maybe is thinking, oh my goodness, I know I'm a bit stuck here, or things might be going wrong, is there one piece of advice you would give them? And the other is, if people wanted to know more about this story, where could they go? Is there a website? Is there a blog? Is there some collateral somewhere they can find out more?
So to answer the first one, the one piece of advice that I would give to anybody, and the one thing that kills off 99% of all businesses, is cash flow. Get on top of your cash flow. Get the best financial advice you can buy, and make sure that you are very, very well supported on the financial side of your business. Just getting into the numbers, knowing every single number in your business, what's coming in, what's going out, what the value is there, it is absolutely critical. So, if you do nothing else other than make sure that you've got the best financial information and the best financial advice around, then do that. That is the primary lesson I think that I've learned from the last couple of years. And reach out if you want more information. I haven't got a website or a blog at the moment. This is a first step to just getting more information out there. But my contact details, Toby will have my contact details there, and absolutely reach out direct. I'm very happy. I've done a couple of sessions with some Vistage groups, so CEO groups, talking through with them, and those have been very effective. Some of the questioning that's come out of those has been very pertinent, and I think, as I said, you learn an enormous amount from people who have been successful. You learn an enormous amount more from people who've been through a journey like I've been on. So I'm very, very happy to talk to people about this.
Sean, Thank you very much. I think that's been very insightful. I think people can learn a lot from your story. I'm very happy that you came on the show, and thank you so much for doing so.
Thank you, Toby. Take care.